Thank you, Madam. Congratulations to Vikram Sambarji. One for getting the fellowship today. Very, very auspicious thing happening on the book launch in Chennai. I always like Indian historians. That is something which our country very rarely had. Very eminent historians of the highest quality. And normally when the first book was there on Savarkar, it looked for many people as a one-time wonder, somebody who got 100 in his first match. And the second book, The Contested Legacy, 1924-66, it hits at 200. A batsman coming to the crease again. Now, the game is set, the talent is proven, the deep research that the book has gone into is absolutely unbelievable. And Savarkar, if you see, for other person it is easy to write a book, relatively easy, especially on Veer Savarkar. It's very tough because normally you ask a person in the street, 8 out of 10, might have a very contesting opinion. And maybe 2 might have a very historical perspective. So writing on Veer Savarkar, the two different volumes, contiguous volumes, it really speaks about the caliber of the author, number one. It's a phenomenal writing. Second, when you go deeper into it, the fluidity of the writing, a connection to it, the documents that come seamlessly, and very important for a historical writer is a very neutral writing. It is not that we are a very fanboy writing of Veer Savarkar. When somebody goes through the book in bold, they will understand that it is not a very fanboy writing of Veer Savarkar. It is from a historical writing. And any person might have his plus and minus. Overall, very good writing. Veer Savarkar, in my humble opinion, because I'm too small a man to comment about him, he might have about 98% plus and 2% minuses here and there. Again, from our perspective, that he has covered beautifully. I think it's a fantastic book, beautifully written. And this book proves beyond doubt that Nicholas Samrat is here to stay. And many books are
Thank you for, you rightly said it speaks to the caliber of the author. So, congratulations again. Since I didn't have the opportunity of speaking with you for the launch of the first volume of this book, and I'm sure some of them here may not have heard you, so I'm really curious, why Savarkar? What was the trigger? Did you choose Savarkar, or as they say, did Savarkar choose you?
Very good evening, everyone, and it's always such a pleasure to be in Chennai, the city that is, my father's federal home. So though my father is not here, he's in Bangalore, I think his heart is right here. A lot of his friends from the Karur Vaishya Bank that he was part of are all part of the audience. So Chennai always matters a lot to him, and by osmosis to me too. And the lucky charm of the city and also of Mr. Annamalai is such that just this afternoon I heard from the Royal History Society in the UK. So it was all very, very propitious. To your question, why Savarkar? I think the answer is why not Savarkar? Because here was a man whose importance, whose political philosophy, whose relevance is so intense in today's contemporary India. The political philosophy of Hindutva that he espoused is something that is in the ascendant today across India. But then I was really quite amazed and alarmed by the curiously lack of academic interest in this man. In the last comprehensive biography of Veer Savarkar was written in the 1960s when he was still alive by this man called Dhananjay Keel. Now after that, year after year, we have numerous biographies of so many people, Gandhiji and Nehru and Bhagat Singh, and rightly so. History is always something that needs to be relooked, re-evaluated. But somehow Savarkar escaped that entire re-evaluation. He was a persona non grata in Indian history. Anybody who even was associated with him in a long measure actually had to pay a very, very heavy price for it with their careers, with their livelihood. I've often mentioned this episode of the famous music composer, Dr. Pandit Hridaynath Mangeshkar, who was a part of the All India Radio. Now, Savarkar, along with being a very great political ideologue, was a prolific poet, Marathi poet par excellence. And he had composed many poems including Jayostute and this very famous Marathi poem named Majasi Ne Parata Matra Bhumila Sagara Prana Tadamadala, so which Hridaynath Mangeshkar ji had tuned, and his sisters Lata ji, Asha ji, all of them had sang. And for that crime of actually tuning Savarkar's poem, Hridaynath ji got a show cause notice from All India Radio saying, "Can you explain why you picked up this poem?" And he's supposed to have given on record a 2-line reply saying, good poem and a great poet. Isn't that reason enough to tune a poem like this? But then he was sacked from All India Radio for doing this. So much for, we talk so much about intolerance and freedom of expression and all that being lacking today. This is the 1950s and 60s where you can't even talk about him. Today we are he's sitting like this and having a mainstream discussion. There is media covering this, and I'm not going to lose any. I don't have a job, but even if I had one, I wouldn't be losing it, anywhere. So that shows that times have changed. Where my constant refrain is, you may like to, admire a person or you may even hate a person, but let that love or hatred for somebody be informed. It cannot be based on the basis of conjectures. It cannot be based on preconceived ideas and worse, I think, political, considerations. And Savarkar was probably the biggest casualty of political machinations that went against him, especially after independence. And as a student of the CBSE syllabus and being a history buff, he was never part of our history textbooks. I don't remember, I don't know how it is now, but at least in my history textbooks, I don't know how it was in yours, he never made an appearance. The first reference to him I came across, my mother was a Maharashtrian, so a lot of my mother's family used to talk about him in whispers and hushes, but didn't know much about him. The first brush was in 2003 when the previous Vajpayee government put up his portrait in the Central Hall of Parliament. There was a lot of hullabaloo about that, and the Vajpayee government also got a plaque in his honor in Kalapani, in cellular jail, where he spent 12 harrowing years. And a year later, when the UPA came to power, you had Mr. Manishankar Iyer actually get that plaque removed and thrown away, and lots of invectives, hurled at him. And since then to now, all the time, he's a part of raucous news debates every night. And political parties also make him a part of their election manifestos. He's a part of election speeches. Mr. Rahul Gandhi today or yesterday also said something against Savarkar. We have the Prime Minister going to cellular jail, and that very powerful imagery of him sitting there and paying his tributes, rightfully so. The governments of various states like Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh spend valuable time to think whether his name should be prefixed with a weed or not and all of this. But in the midst of all this nonsense and noise, if a young man or woman in India today wants to read about him or know what is all this noise all about, where do they go? There's nothing to read. So there was this quote from Toni Morrison who said, if there's a book that you want to write and it has not been written yet, if there's a book that you want to read which has not been written yet, you must be the first one to write it. So I thought Savarkar is someone who is so much an intrusion into contemporary politics, but so under-evaluated, and so something had to be done. And so 5 years plodding through lots of archives, libraries, documents to bring together a very, very complex figure into some kind of semblance of coherence.
Right, lovely. You mentioned about use the word history and history books. So I'm going to kind of fast forward and ask this question about histories being written. Are histories just written usually by the victor? So, I just want you to comment on that. Like, why have we almost cancelled or eliminated this character altogether, right? Would you like to comment on that?
It's very unfortunate, madam. Like you said, history is always written from a winner's perspective, and more importantly, the kind of academic historians from 1950, when they had to look at different personalities and try to project them into the larger national stage, many people are continually forgotten and many people are demonized. And I believe V. Savarkar comes from the demonized category. He was completely demonized. And if you look at his life, immediately after his arrest, London, jumping from ship, again taking him to cellular jail, if you take that as a part of history, it is a different V. Savarkar that we have seen here. Then if you come to the point after his release, when he was forced to curtail himself in Bharathiya, not going out in 1937, that's a different point of V. Savarkar. Where right now if you look at that part, the historians from 1950 to 75, 80 more, they showed him as an apologist, a person who asked apology to the British government, and the apology was given, and then he's moving out. Then again, if you slightly shift from 1948 till about 55, it was more about the person who killed Mahatma Gandhi. So again, a kind of demonization. So when you look back with a very open-eyed view, immediately after his death, the people in power, they looked at V. Savarkar with a different lens. In fact, Madam Indira Gandhi herself, very glowing tribute to the book Vikram Records. Indira Gandhi spoke very, very highly of Savarkar, very glowing tribute. And the Prime Ministers, everybody after Jawaharlal Nehru, they had a very different opinion about Savarkar, maybe a milder opinion. And even the Home Minister of India and the first Nehru cabinet, they had a very different approach. So it's very, very unfortunate, since we are sitting in the land of Tamils. And here, a very favorite historical figure of mine is D.O. Chidambaram Pillai. And we can establish a connection between Chidambaram Pillai and Savarkar through his friends, and he was also influenced. And D.O. Chidambaram Pillai's history is not here, absolutely not here. Likewise, if you look at the scene in the land of Tamils, Mutramani, the Devar is not given the due is. So, it is there at a point of history. The politics of that time dominated. They projected whomever they want to project. And that is why in the opening remarks I said, very, very happy, eminent Indian historians are there. Normally, if you say, you want to read about the book about Hindu, people say read John King. He has written a very fascinating account of it. That's a general opinion when you go and sit in a very high class discussion. People say, you read this guy who's from Britain, he has written a fantastic book on him. When people like Vikram Savarkar come in and kind of take on the whole mantle and give a very different perspective, backed with evidence, backed with the convincing logic, they feel too proud. They are the pressures of India. A fabulous book. It completely, any person reading it for the first time, you take it from me, they will see V. Savarkar with a very, very different perspective. Very different perspective. But maybe the last 1 minute to comment is, you need quality writers with an unbiased account, not connected to a political ideology, with a historical narration. Then probably you have a book like this. So I hope and pray, especially in the land of Tamil Nadu, people buy this book, the 2 volumes, with an open mind they read V. Savarkar. They don't demonize them. Give the person the due, as Indira Gandhi said, a great national guy, a great fierce patriotic guy. This is the words Indira Gandhi used. And I just hope and pray people read it in large numbers, they change their opinion based on facts and logic.
Absolutely. In today's world, we call this cancel culture. Right? Would you like to comment on that?
About the book or about me or about Savarkar?
I think all of it, right? I mean, I'm just also curious that by virtue of writing about Savarkar, it's not biography writing, is not new to you.
Yeah.
But how have people responded to you post your biography of Savarkar? Like, has cancel culture happened there?
I've always faced that a lot. So it's been a little hardened now. In fact, in 2015, I founded the Bangalore Literature Festival, and I had written an article on why I will not return my Sahitya Academy Award. That was the height of the award boxing drama that was going on there. And as for that crime again, a lot of people, authors, eminent authors of this country, who were supposed to come to the festival, they recused themselves, saying this is a fascist festival, this is a right-winger, this and that, and so on. So much so that I had to resign from the festival that I founded. So this cancel culture is not something that is unknown to me. But particularly with this book, what really shocked me, Akila, was the curious lack of engagement with the book, particularly mainstream media, particularly print media. It's electronic media, I think they want some masala for everyday news debates. But print media, even if you want to ban the book, keep it at an arm's length. And I was more, shocked to know that there were several bookstores, including in my hometown Bangalore, which didn't stock the book. And when my publishers asked them, they said, I've been in the literary field now for a little more than a decade. They said, my other books would be there, but this book will not be there. So they said, we have nothing against the author, but we don't want to spoil our bookstore by keeping a book on Savarkar. And despite that, the book going on to become a national bestseller, both the volumes, speaks volumes about the democratization of opinion today through social media. But for social media and the word of mouth, these gatekeepers who control everything, every opinion, what people need to read, what people need to think, how they need to think, was controlled by a few dogs in the manger. So today, I think thanks to social media is what this book went on to become the success it became, despite bookstores not stocking it. So much so that the pressure then builds on them. Many people go and ask them, why don't you have this book? And then they are forced to keep it. So then that was very, very, they were not surprised by this attitude, but it was shocking that they go to this depth. That, you, as I said, hate the man for all I care. But at least read about him. In Europe, year after year, you have so many books written about Hitler written. So why this anathema to someone? Why? And somebody who all his life actually strove for elimination of untouchability is today a political untouchable, which is the biggest irony and paradox of destiny.
So basically, you were Hitler, Savas, treatment, so to speak. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about in terms of material, and you speak about how you had a ton of material that was available on Savas, also because his life was, so to speak, under surveillance, right? So you had material sourced from the British Museum in London, from the Nehru Museum in Delhi. I'm curious about how you plodded through this material and what were some of the principles of biography that you adhered to ensure that at no point it looked like you were carried away by someone, so to speak, right?
Yeah. So in my earlier biographies, it's always been looking for that needle in a haystack. When I wrote about Bharathiya, a Tawayef who died way back in the 1930s, there was so little material. Whereas here it was a problem of plenty. But that was also alarming to some extent, because as a senior research fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, there's an entire microfilm section of about 26 microfilms called the Savarkar private papers that I got access to. Each microfilm about 1,000, 2,000 pages, so you can multiply that by 26, that kind of material, where every letter that went in and out of his house was intercepted, both by the British government and also the first independent government of India. And when I saw the accession registers, they were never ever accessed by any mainstream historians of India, all of whom come day in and day out to make narratives about the person, never read anything about the man. The material which was sitting right there in the archives. So several lakhs of pages of such documentation in the British archives in London, where I spent a significant amount of time in the UK, and also in France and Germany and so on, to trace the entire history of the early revolutionary movement of India, which was all happening in Europe for the complete liberation. And I'm talking of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And a copious amount of material in Marathi, which again I think mainstream historians have not accessed either willfully or because of their lack of knowledge of the language. And Savarkar wrote prolifically in Marathi. He was a poet, he was a playwright, he was a historian, amateur historian, he was a journalist. So all of his writings in Marathi nobody had accessed. So without any background as to what the person stood for or what he said, narratives were being made. So for me, to be honest, it was like looking literally at a mountain of material. And I mentioned in the prologue too that when I've always been in doubt, the one person I would go to was my mother, who was my friend, philosopher, guide. And I asked her, I said, I don't think I'm worthy enough of doing justice to this man, because it's like mountain climbing, and it's Mount Everest that I need to trek. She was not a mountain climber herself, but she gave me an advice which kind of stuck with me. She said, when you're trekking, you should never look up to see how much is left to traverse. You don't look back to see how much you have covered. Just be in the present, do step by step, and before you realize you are right at the summit. And I think that's a very pertinent advice. That don't get bogged down, just take year by year, what all is there, just try to tabulate it, put it together. And before I realized the end of the book had come. But your other important question on biography writing, that's very interesting, because I usually liken biography writing to a love affair. You fall in love with a person, and you are impressed with a character, and that is why you pick that character up. It's the character may be in a relatively unmovable condition or even dead, but still you chase your love interest. All you rummage through their letters, their archives, their friends become your friends, their enemies become your enemies, and probably you know much more about the character than they knew about themselves, because you have a 360-degree view of their entire life. But the biggest responsibility that is called upon on a writer, on a biographer, is while you are committing it to print, you need to step back and take that neutral position. Suddenly you are supposed to snap all your emotional cords, otherwise there's a very, very thin line between a biography and a hagiography. And that thing is very difficult to do because you are emotionally invested in the person, you've fallen in love. But then if you keep singing pains of glory to the person, then the credibility is so less. So this conscious attempt that, hey listen, I'm not here to be an advocate of the man. I'm not here to correct some historical wrongs and make presumptions of my importance like that. I'm just presenting the facts. The historian's responsibility, according to me, is to illuminate the archives for a discerning reader and let her make up her mind after reading all the documents as to what she thinks Savarkar's legacy is all about. There's no need for me to sit in judgment and as a judge, prosecutioner, jury to say this is what he was, which is what I think historical accounts become. It becomes very, very judgmental. So I've consciously tried in both these volumes to ensure that the facts, as Mr. Annamalai mentioned, are presented before the reader. After reading all of this, if someone still thinks Savarkar was a British stooge, he was an apologist, he was a murderer, he was whatever, Islamophobe, whatever epithets are thrown at him, I mean, so be it. But you at least have some backing information for that. Let it not be calumny without a basis.
Also, I suppose while writing it, you're sort of attached to your subject, but also consciously detached, right? That detached attachment that you have to practice while you're writing it. I want to sort of shed light and move in the direction of one of his major social reforms that he advocated, which was untouchability. Also, way back in the 1920s, he focused on intercaste dining. At a time, Vikram, that you mentioned, when even subcastes within the Maharashtrian Brahmin community were not eating together. How far have we come from, from that time? Like, have we moved forward, or are we still fighting those issues?
Ma'am, as you rightly put it, Savarkar was a very different man of his time, at the time that was. And what he was trying to do to reform Hinduism per se. In the book he beautifully writes, for a lot of people's information, that he never believed in the ritual part of Hinduism. He believed in the ethos of what we're trying to talk about, Hindutva. And let us take us back to 1920, 1930 time, in a state like Maharashtra. Look at the photographs that Vikram Savarkar has presented. Samabandi Bhojana, where he calls all caste, the so-called untouchables, who were treated very, very rudely at the point of time, made them to sit on a common platform. He takes that food along with them, and then conveys a very, very powerful statement that the internal reformation is happening. And the sacred threading ceremony, he brings all the different castes together, the sacred threading ceremony that very eloquently our Vikram Savarkar puts it. When you look at it, you will truly understand that this is real social justice. I'm talking about 1920, 30, 40, in that kind of era, when India was chained to the yoke of British imperialism and nobody was thinking about reforming Hinduism per se or the Hindutva ethos. It was far ahead of its time. And if I transport that memory to the run of comments now, post 1950, and we had a period in Tamil Nadu, maybe from 1917, when the backward classes movement started. Then the Justice Party, then the Dravidian Munnetra Party came into existence. 1967 they came into power. When you look at it, and when you look history in its proper depth, you know what Savarkar did was unparalleled, far ahead of his time. So definitely the society has changed, but the only problem is, we have the last 10 years I'm seeing we as a society, we don't read much. We don't read different points of view. We don't talk to people whom we inherently might not be friends with. Maybe a contradicting popular opinion they might have. When you talk to one of them, probably all of these people can be put up in better light. So now we have got into this very artificial barrier of, you don't agree with me, you're out, I'm this side. So since that artificial wall is built, I think we are getting into a very dangerous step, because you are demonizing person and then you are glorifying a particular point of time to suit your political narrative. So though it was good time, after the social media revolution, we are getting into a dangerous time where from anonymity, whatever you say, whatever you post, probably 25 years from now, when small kids now, when they look back at Tamil Nadu's history or India's history, probably they'll be very amused. Is this kind of volume of writing you're producing in social media, is this what you're writing in Twitter? And yesterday, Rahul Gandhi ji in Wayanad, he has spoken about Savarkar. And if you read it, it's very, very amusing what he has said. Though I'm talking about now, he's talking about Congress believes in a different India, Congress don't believe in Savarkar's India. If you look at the 1965 interview that Savarkar gave, which beautifully presents in the last part, probably might have a question on that to him, there he very clearly talks about what is the India that is looking at. Right from the Indus River to the seas, where all different communities should coexist. It's a secular country, one community not dominating others, not divided by artificial lines. And just when I was reading that part today, after hearing Rahul Gandhi yesterday, I was just wondering, it is like chalk and cheese, what Rahul Gandhi ji was talking in Wayanad yesterday and what Savarkar's interview in 1965, probably his last interview to the RSS magazine. Very different. I hope and pray these people of the generation, they read much, they listen to different points of view, and then they make it go.
Absolutely. I mean, something like that. Listening to each other, we stop listening to each other. I also want to ask you a little bit about, speaking of the untouchability issue, isn't it a bit ironical that, Ambedkar was also a huge campaigner of untouchability? Savarkar and Ambedkar actually never shared state space. I'm curious about some of your findings and how do you, while writing, negotiate these ambiguities?
That's something I found very alarming because the 13 years that Savarkar was kept in house arrest in Ratnagiri, Maharashtra, it became like a social laboratory of the Hindutva that he had written in the Ratnagiri prison. How do you consolidate the Hindu society, removing all these terrible barriers that we have created amongst ourselves? So if you have to be a resisting force, you first need to be united among yourselves. So that was the fundamental, philosophy, and how do you put that to practice through, your own leadership. And the Sapta Bandis that he spoke, the 7 shackles of Hindu society, I think a lot of it is so relevant even now to some extent and not so much. So what were those 7 shackles which according to him held Hindu society hostage? Vedokta Bandi, what Sir mentioned about the Vedas are not to preserve just one community, nor is Sanskrit just a language for one community. It is universal, knowledge and wisdom. It should be easily accessible to everybody. So his philosophy probably different from what a Periyar movement here would do of coming into people's homes and cutting off their sacred threads. Here it was going and giving that sacred thread to everybody and saying, this is your passport to Vedic literature, please take it. And he being a Chitpavan Brahmin was qualified enough to initiate anyone into the so-called Brahminhood. And he time and again said the whole Varna, even Lord Krishna in the Gita, talks about the Varnas not as gunas and not as something that was hereditary. Everybody is born a Shudra and then they ascend to the different levels of their achievement, either through their temperament, through their achievements in life. So the Vedokta Bandi was the first shackle he spoke about. Vyavasaya Bandi, where he said the whole belief that you are born into a particular profession, it's not hereditary, it's again based on your merit. You can aspire for anything if you are qualified enough. And contrasting that to the same time when Gandhiji, there were a group of untouchables, so-called untouchables, not even say that now, but the group of so-called untouchables go to meet Gandhiji. And he tells them that everybody cannot become a viceroy or a prime minister. You have to be born in a particular family, the seeds of dynasty maybe, to have those leadership genes to aspire for the top post. Now, how antithetical is it to the very philosophy of democracy? So, Vyavasaya Bandi, where meritocracy is what matters, not hereditary profession that you follow. Samudra Bandi, the whole idea of the Hindu society that if you cross the seas, you will lose your caste. That was something he was against, that go to the enemy's camp. His Marathi book was also called Shatruncha Shibirat. Inside the enemy camp, you enter their camp, learn their strategies and beat them at it. So don't assume that if you just cross over to the seas, you will lose your caste and all that. So take the best of everything that the world has to offer. Sparsha Bandi, untouchability should be completely eliminated. and all castes and varnas also to be completely eliminated. Shuddhi Bandi, those of the Hindus who had been taken out of the fold, either due to allurement or coercion, there should be some mechanism to bring them back, because the Hindu faith is not a proselytizing one. There is no mechanism to reconvert and so on. So, using the Arya Samaj methods of Shuddhi, how can you bring them back into the fold? And Roti Bandi and Beti Bandi, the last two, which was intercaste, dining and intercaste marriage. The first ever intercaste cafe in India, where people of all communities could sit together and eat. Today it may seem very normal, but that time, and even among the Maharashtrian Brahmins, the Deshasthas would not sit with the Chitpavans and Konkanasthas. So at that time, to have a Mahar, a Chamar, all these different communities, Kodis and Marathas sit together and have Sahab Bhojan, that was a huge leap and a hit at the very root of casteism. And the first temple called the Patit Pavan Mandir, which he established in 1931 in Ratnagiri, where members of all communities could go and pray, and building on Lokmanya Tilak's iconography of Ganpati Utsav and how that could be used to galvanize people. Savarkar started this whole Asprishya Ganpati, or untouchable Ganpati, where the Ganpati was actually installed. The priest would be from the lowest in the caste hierarchy, and even the Brahmin had to go and touch his feet to take blessings. Schools where people of all communities children of all communities could sit together and study, which again today is so normal, but in those days, the teacher, the teachers, if they had to admonish the kid, the child from the so-called untouchable classes would have to sit outside the class, and if they had to admonish them, they would throw a chalk piece at him, they would not even touch them. So, to that extent, to have all of them sit together in the same class and study, in those 13 years, there were these path-breaking reforms. And he writes repeatedly to Dr. Ambedkar that, why don't you come to Ratnagiri and see what I have done? And this is a pilot project, and my area of operation is only here. But you are a national leader, and if you and I collaborate, maybe we can remove untouchability in the next and caste system in the next 10 years. But curiously, as you rightly observed, Ambedkar kept giving a lot of excuses. Of course, he gave a lot of laudatory letters to Savarkar, saying you are the only one who has understood that the Varna system is at the root cause of Jativad and Jati Pratha and all that, while no one else has understood this. But he, fell short of sharing stage with him. Because again, I think this whole element of cancel culture, persona non grata, if you are seen with him, your career will be spoiled. So till the time he was under British surveillance in Ratnagiri till 1937, he made some excuse or the other, but never shared space with him. But later on, coming from the same state and cultural milieu, Maharashtra, Ambedkar later, of course, built bridges. And even when Savarkar was accused in the Gandhi assassination, Ambedkar was then the law minister of India. And he used to attend the trials at the Red Fort, where for 1 year the trial happened. And it is a very curious and interesting incident I quote in the book, where Ambedkar is supposed to have called up Savarkar's lawyer, Bhopatkar, and said, I want to meet you. And then he calls him to some place in Delhi, where Ambedkar himself is driving the car, and he asks Bhopatkar to hop in. And they drive a little, and then he says, the evidence against your client, there is absolutely no evidence. He will get away, so don't worry about that. It's a fixed match. And the highest, from the highest power in the government of India, the orders have come to fix him. And the cabinet is deeply divided about it. Even Sardar Patel does not approve of this. And then Bhopatkar, in that paragraph I quote, he says, Jawaharlal Nehru, why would he have come to do that? And it ends there. So giving a lot of dots to connect as to what was done, why it was done, by whom it was done. But by that time, it does seem that Ambedkar did share the sympathy for Savarkar, that he was being unfairly targeted in a crime that he did not commit.
It's also beautiful because you also see a very human side of Savarkar. How vulnerable the man is. And also his is a life that is literally stripped off, right? Right from his educational degrees, money, perks, privileges, nothing, right? I also read that in fact he was not even invited to the Independence Day celebrations when the flag was being hoisted right a kilometer away from his home in Dadar in Mumbai. What does it take, like having spent so much time in the world of Savarkar, what according to you does it take for someone to constantly keep rising above the ashes, to push back and say, I'll still do it, I'll still ensure that, what I'm saying, I'll make my voice heard. Like, what do you think are some of those qualities?
That's quite a question. I think even those 12 years that we spent in Kalapani, the worst of tortures which we can't even, think of, human being bearing that, the basic human facilities of good food, toilet, or medical facilities not provided to most of them, treated worse than animals. Animals are not given that kind of harsh penalty. In the blazing heat of Port Blair, he and also all the other political prisoners, day in and day out, they have to do this Poluka Bell punishment, the grinding mill, oil grinding mill, where they go round and round the oil grinding machine and extract 30 pounds of oil. And if you don't extract that, then you are whiplashed, you are not fed, and so on. And the food that was given, full of insects and reptile pieces and all that, and most of them eating that, they would end up with diarrhea, most of the political prisoners. And I know it's terrible to even talk about that, but I think it should be put on record. They faced it, they are just talking about it. There were fixed timings to go to the toilet. And so if someone was suffering from diarrhea, you were not allowed to go. So, and there was also standing handcuffs punishment for weeks on end. So most of the political prisoners would end up urinating and defecating in their own cells and sitting amidst their own squalor, sitting, eating, sleeping amidst that. The gunny sacks that were used to make their uniforms there, leeches that biting into their skin but not getting treatment. And Savarkar was given solitary confinement for 6 months during the lockdown period with all our luxuries. When we were stripped off from social communication, we all went crazy, and we continue to go crazy perhaps. But then solitary confinement, when no human contact for 6 months, and his cell, if you see even now in cellular jail, it overlooks the gallows, where the only human being you would see is someone screaming and shouting to be taken for their execution. So in the midst of all of this, he writes, in his memoir called in Marathi called Maji Janmathe, or My Transportation for Life, he says there were several moments where I gave up, and not only him, there were other prisoners like Indu Bhushan Roy, Ulaskar Dutt and others, who either committed suicide or a lot of them went mad. In fact, the British started an asylum in Port Blair in the Hutto Island just to lodge all our ancestors who were political revolutionaries, because they just could not take this kind of torture. And he writes in that very candidly and unabashedly that I gave up my will to survive because death seemed better than living. And he tried to commit suicide a couple of times, but he said every time that happened, I resorted to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras or our philosophy, the reading that was that he had internalized, because they were not given, by the way, books of pen and paper. Through his nails or through charcoal, he would write on the walls of the cell, not 1 or 2 but 6,000 lines of poetry. And to spite him, you had this inhuman jailer called Barry who would come and whitewash the thing right in front of him. But little did he know that this man had such an elephantine memory that he had committed all of that to memory, and he came out and got those poems published, and we still have them with us. So in such a condition, not only did he read this, do a lot of meditation and Patanjali's Sutras, as I said, all these I think kept his own spirit alive, but he would also go and advise the other prisoners who were much younger than him, who looked up to him for leadership, saying don't commit suicide, don't go do all this fast unto death and all that, and eat nicely, don't starve, eat nicely, become fat and give it back to them. So I think it required a tenacity of another kind to actually keep your spirit. And probably after facing that kind of torture, these things probably seem much less that someone did invite you to some flag hoisting. Okay, well, you've seen the worst. So these are very small things in comparison. So it really, but then eventually, I think he did get extremely disillusioned is what I saw, because he didn't have a natural death. he gave up his life in that Jain tradition of Pariyopaveshan, where you give up water, food, and medicines, and willfully he said, I think I have my debt to my motherland is done, and I have completed all that I owed. He was already 83, 84. So he gave up and left. So I think it's only towards the end that probably he raised his hands and said, thus far and no further. But till then, there was this constant pushback against everything, every knock that destiny and society and politics was giving to him.
Thank you so much for that. I'm not sure we have a little more time for okay. Actually, I want to speak about the Mahatma Gandhi murder case. You know, that he was, in the book, especially the latter half of the book, the courtroom drama and all of that. But I think also, I noticed that how he stands up constantly, especially I remember this particular episode to speak about how when Kasturba Gandhi died, the Congress invited donations from people to Gandhi to contribute to women who were suffering. And at that point, I think Savarkar stood up and said, like, why? Right? Why not to so many other women who are suffering? So, could you speak about this constant, back and forth that ideologically that Mahatma Gandhi and Savarkar had? So, if you have any interesting, discoveries that you made.
The man of the moment is here, but still, I'll give you my 2 cents now. The previous question and this one. As IPS probationers, I go back to my old times 10 years back.
I should have asked you that question.
One of the compulsory visits for us was to go to Andaman, be it Sirla jail, and go there and see the exact cell where V. Savarkar was imprisoned. It's a very corner cell. You got to climb up the stairs, you go there. I still vividly recall the whole moment there. As the author said, Vikram, he said, from the window you can see the death gallows outside. And that did not register as much. We were 21, 22 at that point of time. We went to Cellular Jail. We saw that big thing where he has to grind there and take the oil out. That later, during the course of our policing careers, I must have arrested about 10,000, 15,000 people in my life, different points of time. And from a Taluk jail to a district jail to a central jail. And I used to do this jail visit often. Jail visit often, once in a month, once in 3 months, go meet it. And then I could understand the full import of what Veer Savarkar must have felt in Cellular Jail that kind of time. And people get broken. The best way, it's a very, very philosophical kind of thing, which was applied in psychology. The best way to break a man is to take him away from the loved ones. So that is part 1. Then, in the book, Veer Savarkar talks about the happiest moments. This man is dying, in 1965 he is dying. When the question was put to him, the best part of his life, he says 2-3 things. He says, meeting my wife after 8 years in jail. My wife and my brother coming and meeting me after 8 years. And he was put in that kind of a mental space. Treated very harshly. I don't think any political prisoner in India's independence history, pre-independence, they never had to do what Veer Savarkar did. It's a fact. And the kind of things he was made to understand. That's why the name Kala Pani was taken. The name itself was terrible. And coming from there, coming back, reorienting himself, where he was made to sign the declaration where he gave something was written, he signed it. Then reinventing him every single time after that, 1937, Hindu Mahasabha president, then post-independence. Then again the second disaster of the Mahatma Gandhi's killing, again coming out of it, writing voraciously. Then till 1966. So it's a very, very different man. I don't think there is no equal comparison to any political person in India where you can favorably or unfavorably compare them to Veer Savarkar. This is a very unique person, at a unique point of India's history, who underwent some horrible things which was done on him, which no other political prisoner must have gone through. Now, we all conveniently said, if you look at Tamil Nadu, if you look at the history here, and we have the great people who are praised by the Tamil media, praised by the political narrative. 1941, the same person said, he said, please don't go out British. You be there in India. If you go out to Tamil Nadu, we can't even manufacture a single matchstick. The 1941, he said it. 1955, the same person was changed. The narrative was a great fighter. 1967, the great fighter was changed as a social justice champion. So this guy never wavered. You put him in any terrible condition, he never wavered. He always spoke to. That is what I got from his whole imprisonment thing. And thanks to Vikramji, very beautifully, the way he talks about the Andaman experience and coming out, when the Mahatma Gandhi assassination case. I think the best part, though I've read many case studies on the assassination case and the Red Fort trial and everything, but I don't think anybody can do justice to the way he has gone into it. With deep research, wonderfully written book, especially on two parts, the cellular jail part and the Mahatma Gandhi assassination part. Simply.
It's so visual, right? You can almost like, especially the courtroom drama is so evocative.
You asked about Gandhi and Savarkar. The two opposite poles of Indian history, which are irreconcilable according to me. I think in Parliament, their pictures hang directly opposite to each other. I don't attribute our leaders with so much this thing that they would have actually thought about it. It was quite coincidental, but it just ended up that way. But they are that, that kind of complete polar opposites. And in the first volume, I actually recount these very interesting, incidents where as young men they meet. The first time they meet in London in 1906 or so, and Savarkar is in this India House, and Gandhi comes from South Africa to meet some of the revolutionaries there. And he goes and tries to meet him, but he's in the kitchen. Savarkar is in the kitchen and cooking prawns. And so Chippa and Brahmin cooking prawns, and then he offers it to Gandhi also, and he says, no, I'm a vegetarian and I don't take this. And he shides him, saying, this is only boiled fish, so if you cannot eat with us, how can you work with us? And we want young men who can go and eat the British alive, and you can't even eat boiled fish. So it was not the best of first meetings. But a few years later, 2-3 years later, in 1909, I'm so bad at dates as a historian, but 1909, when they meet again in London, it is the Dashera festival, where the India House used to organize all these speeches by leaders and so on. So there was one, Gandhiji was also there, and he was invited to speak, and he said, I will not talk anything political. I will talk about the greatness of Ram Rajya and its establishment and the importance of ahimsa to achieve that. And immediately after that, Savarkar comes on to the podium and he refutes every little shreds his arguments by saying, you spoke about Ram Rajya, but even Ram had to kill Ravan to establish Ram Rajya. He did not go and sit in Satyagraha in front of Ravana, and Ravana said, okay, thank you, and send Sita away. He had to fight a war and kill the man. And he said, we are celebrating this, we are having this speech in the middle of Dasara, when all the 9 days, the Devi is worshipped with all her, astras and shastras, and these are not ornamental things. So annihilation of evil is very much a part of, Hindu or Indian tradition. The whole Mahabharata war, where Lord Krishna himself advises Arjuna that if the person is on the path of adharma, that person may be your relative, he may be your guru, he may be anything. Your duty is first to annihilate him. So his question to Gandhi then was, do you consider the British Raj as adharmic? If it is, then picking up the gun or the shastras to annihilate it is not against our culture. It is a part, it's a bounden duty. And this whole absolute ahimsa, where you don't be the first one to throw the stone, but if someone is attacking you, you don't show your other cheek. So that absolutist, ahimsa is something that he was completely against. And at that very fundamental point, I think the two men, they completely disagreed with each other. They met only thrice in life. The third time I recount in this book, where in 1926 or so, when he was in Ratnagiri, Gandhi and Kasturba also come to meet him. The two women, Savarkar's wife Yamuna and Kasturba, they go inside and have a chit chat. And these two men have a long discussion and arguments where Gandhi says, don't do all this Shuddhi movement, and it spoils the social fabric and national unity, Hindu-Muslim unity. And all of that, they disagree. And while going, Gandhi is supposed to have said, I think our thoughts will never converge, but will you allow me to do my experiments? And Savarkar is supposed to have retorted, and his secretary recounts that, which I quote, saying, Mahatmaji, you can of course go on with your experiments, but please be aware that these experiments will be at the cost of the country. And prophetic as it may be, 2 decades later, what all happened, the horrors of partition, the way the subcontinent was sliced, and everything else. I think history is the jury to see who was right and what was wrong. So it was very ironical that the same man then gets implicated in the murder of the same person whom he has had an ideological tiff. It's almost like, one of those Shakespearean tragedies where it's so spooky and eerie, and he's implicated in it, as I indicated, maybe due to political fixing, bases only one police approver statement where police coercion, I think, can make people give lots of witnesses and statements. So there was one such approver called Bharathiya, who was a petty criminal himself. He was an arms dealer and all that, and this man is supposed to have given this statement to the Bombay police that he went along with Nathuram Godse and Narayan Apte, the main killers, to Savarkar's house, and Savarkar gave this gun to him in typical Bollywood style and said, "Yashasvi hoon ya," or in Marathi saying, "Be successful and come back." And that was Bharathiya's statement. So it's just this one statement which was enough to implicate someone, and the police tried and the prosecution tried to retrofit that. For one long year the prosecution went on. It tried to get many people who could corroborate that one line. It said Yashasvi hoon ya, be successful. It could have meant anything, be successful in whatever. So because even if actually one, the interesting part which I discovered is these men, Godse and others, they were not professional killers. They were just these really maverick kind of young men with, they were seeing the horrors of partition, they had seen the Naukhali tragedies.
Speak about how they practice.
Yes. Yeah. So the idea to actually assassinate Gandhiji, as heinous as it was, came to their minds only by 12th of January 1948. Till then, they were just fired with this whole zeal that we have to take revenge against all that was happening. The first idea they had was, we should all go to Pakistan and bomb the assembly of Pakistan when it's in session, so that Jinnah and the rest can just be blown off. Never, attention for detail was not important. Like, how do you actually take all the bombs there? How are you going to execute it? But yeah, let's do this, let's gather money. So that zeal was there. When that was seemingly not possible to achieve, the next idea was, can we loot the Nizam's treasury, which was going from Maharashtra to Hyderabad state, because the Nizam was retiring into joining the Indian Union. Now that also failed. But on 12th of January, when Gandhiji announced his fast unto death, forcing the government of India to hand over 55 crores to Pakistan, at a time when Pakistani army men in the guise of tribesmen were intruding into Kashmir and occupying a large part of it, and the government of India, particularly Sardar Patel, had the intuition to say, till Pakistan vacates that thing, we are not going to give the 55 crores that was due to Pakistan during the partition, the liability and asset division. But Gandhiji said, no, this is going to be a gentleman's promise, we have to give it to them. And he also had this idea that East and West Pakistan, which were so far away from each other, you needed to connect it through a road, through a grand highway that would connect East and West Pakistan, what is Bangladesh. Imagine a road cutting through the very heart of India and what it would mean for our national security and sovereignty. So at that point, these young men said, our victim has presented himself in front of us, so let us go for it. And so 12th of January, they decide on a rookie attempt that let's bomb it off. And so in that 1 week, they get this pistol from here and there, and they have an aborted attempt. The first attempt on Gandhiji's life was made on 20th of January, and it was unsuccessful. And the biggest charade that I saw in the course of my research was between 20th of January and 30th, when the actual act was committed. The police of both the states, Bombay police and the Delhi police, had 10 days, valuable clues which they could nab and catch the culprits if they wanted to. Such rookies they were that Nathuram and Apte, in the hotel that they were staying in Delhi, they give their clothes for laundry, thinking that we'll come back the next. The evening you are planning to go and assassinate a man as father of the nation, and you think you still have the time to come back and take your laundry clothes, and the laundry clothes has the initial NVG, Nathuram Vinayak Godse, on it, and the police get that shirt also. And one of the fellows who put the bomb, Madan Lal Pahwa, he is in the police custody. He has given a testament as to what the plan was. But the police do not take any cognizance of that. The government of Bombay, the central government are just sitting in their own this thing that maybe we can avert it. No extra security is given to Gandhiji. And he literally becomes what I've called a sitting duck, and that's what eventually the heinous crime of assassinating him happens. But the whole tragedy of this story is really comic tragedy, and the 11,100 pages of archival documents in the National Archives is what I have tried to plot through a lot of legal papers on the Gandhi murder trial to try to make some meaning of this madness. And the story that emerges is very, very different from what we are all fed to in popular narrative.
That's interesting. I also want to mention heinous crimes. I also want to talk to you a little bit about heinous crimes that were perpetrated on the Maharashtrian soon after on the Maharashtrian Brahmins. And I believe you put out a social media post asking for families who had suffered these tragedies to come and share first-person accounts. Just talk a little bit about that. Then we will probably take a few questions.
Sure. So that was another episode, which I think has been suppressed so badly that just as in 1984 you had the anti-Sikh riots after Indira Gandhi's murder, it was a trailer to that in 1948, where just because Godse and Apte and others belong to the Maharashtrian Brahmin community, the caste of the assassins was leaked out by somebody in Delhi within few hours of the crime. And the same evening, riots broke out in Bombay, and then Bombay, Pune, Nagpur, Satara, the whole Patwardhan, Princely States, Belgaum, Kolhapur, all these areas, first was Chitpagan Brahmins, and anybody with the surname Godse, they were literally taken and burnt alive. And later the crimes against all of the Maharashtrian Brahmins, whether it was Deshasthas or Chitpavans. And there's a scholar I quote called Maureen Patterson who came to India in the 1950s to investigate or research about this, and she says she was denied information from the Maharashtra police. The Brahmins were actually killed, and the numbers would never be actuality because no FIR cases were not registered, and there was a complete cleansing of stages. Interesting, you go to many villages in Maharashtra, one or two Brahmins, most of them have migrated off Bombay, Pune, the cities, Mysore state, and all of that. So something of this extent committed these crimes. That also one of the Congress's leaders, Bharatiya Prasad Mishra, Minister of the Central Provinces, he writes in his memoirs, and I quote, he says most of the people which went and rampaged houses, men, women, children were very senior Congress officers, and there was a lot of pressure that was put on him and not arrest and that we will take it up Sardar Patel Center and he clearly mentions that episode. And then I decades have passed, and I put out when there are no documents. What does a historian narrative, oral history fall like? With social media, you can crowdsource stories. So I put out a post saying we have family tragedies, what your ancestors faced in 1940. Can you share with me? I did not publish it, consent. I was used with so many words, so many article for a lot of these stories of what all happened to them. But when I asked them, can I quote many of them back? Some of them said you can want us, names, so the first person accounts are all there. most of it is under, as I said, even to this day, the people who led the mobs, their successors of the parties are in positions of a lot of authority and power in Maharashtra. We have rebuilt our lives, we don't want to jeopardize all over again. Please let me write the episode. Please don't take that. So I think world over, history gives us the space where we can count the horrors of the past, heal those wounds, ensure crimes are never committed again. If we had set an example of how state against hoodlums on an entire community, assassin or the leader, national leader, belong to a particular maybe 1984 would not have been. That is the whole perversity which I think is repeating itself because the first time. And so I think this was a very sad episode of Maharashtra's political history. Probably for the first time it's come out. In fact, I wanted to bring out just like that episode, Maharashtra, Brahmin, Carnage. I got a lot of backlash. A lot of people said, value your life, go ahead with doing an entire project on that. Too dangerous. Is the fear and the mahal that we live today, where we can't even write, where we can't hear the space to heal and learn lessons from. I'm like a punishment. I'm writing one is the biography and the other is on Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Both of them are very contemporary politics, contemporary public source in today's hard and to start looking for asylum.
Was the last use of Savarkar's was to organizer in 1960 and responding to a question on the history of your dreams. There's a beautiful perhaps on page 550.
Want me to read it?
Just take questions from
Thank you so much. There was a very beautiful interview that Savarkar gave it to an organizer, 1965. Probably was first time in the mainstream book. Vikram Samajya brought it back. The question that was asked is what is the India of your dreams? He replies, my India would be a democracy in which people belong to different religions, sects or races with perfect equality. None would be allowed to dominate others. None would be deprived. None would be just equal rights of reason. So long as discharging common obligation which he owed to the state as a whole. Hindustan, the motherland, and the holy land of the Indus to the sea, would be an organic, undivided state. The Hindus would be a casteless society, consolidated as the modern nation. Science and technology would be encouraged. There would be a total liquidation of landlords. All the land would belong to the state eventually. All key industries would be nationalized. India would be sufficient in respect of food, shelter, and defense. The India of my dream would have unbound in the world common, because the earth is the common motherland of all. But India would not under the evolution of this world common. The foreign policy of arbitrarily ardent Hindustan would be a policy of neutrality and peace. And a powerful Hindustan contributes effectively to enduring peace and prosperity in the world.
Perhaps we must take from questions from there is a mic that can Madhurya, have a mic.
Yeah. Vikram you so one associated you with after finance biography you turn the piece now what's your methodology and your approach was it different political biography and thank you, sir. I think I'm still very much associated with fine arts in my heart. Without the gift of the blessing of that music and literature, I would have started grown up. But then, as I said, the whole approach to biography writing is the same, irrespective whether that person is a dancer, musician, politician. To me, the principles that I should mention, going after the person, unearthing every possible DJ, but also having that conscious detachment while writing about it. And how do you see through the material? Those become important elements while writing a biography. Doesn't matter what the person was. For me, the person I choose is someone who needs to be interesting, has multiple shades, either very maligned, misunderstood, or misrepresented, or totally forgotten who Bharathiya was. Dare I say till the time, but despite she being the first Indian artist in the entire subcontinent, record her voice on the gramophone, her memory fade off from national consciousness. But for her and women like who recorded music industry was not anywhere. And Vinay Balachandran again from this very and so many firsts to his credit. Self-taught, learned genius who pioneered so many Tamil cinema, Tamil Carnatic music, entire Veena playing of Veena, again forgotten, become forgotten and not forgotten, and become a little bit of social untouchable for his very strong thought was classicism, the whole episode of Royal versus music. So these are characters that become very interesting to assess, and that is what attracts me. Attracts so much the profession they followed in their life. The colors, not a monochromatic, simplistic, very linear, boring, right, and also to read.
Since we are here, if you could book I guess previous 5 years for right hand during South and had they not been building something movement in Tamil Nadu, might not have. That's a fantastic question because previous Iyer and Acharya, 5 years that Savarkar spent at the house in London was a bit of what the British called sedition. Fascinating characters. Again, don't ring a bell today. Virendra Chattopadhyay, Saroj Bradar, who was there. The microcosm of India, every part. Lala Padayal in the party in Delhi, Madanlal Dhingra from Punjab, Madam Bhikaji Ka, Parsi woman from Bombay, who went and unfurled the flag of independent guards in Germany in 1907. Sardar Singh Rana, and from the south, including Acharya from Mysore, and VVS Iyer from Tamil. VVS Iyer was the left-hand man of South, including the book, the 1857 revolution, which actually Savarkar coined the word war of India. Then it was called as Sepoy Mutiny. Savarkar spent 2 years researching British archives and history of India from an Indian so that it is disparage as small episode of boys throwing leaf flower and cartilage. So to give that gravitas to the entire movement, Savarkar not the booking, but BBS Iyer got it translated in English. Then made their way. They served as an not just that generation, but that generations later the Bible for the revolution. Bhagat Singh was so inspired by that he would make it as an entry criteria for the HSI. Unless you not read the part of the revolutionary. Netaji Subhash had copies of Raj Bihari Bose had copies of the book translated from Japanese to even Tamil, where grades of the INA copies of this. All of this, previous Iyer played a very important role. One more interesting thing that previous Iyer all the time he had these Savarkar. He wrote his own biography in the pseudonym of Chitra's praise to the sky. Now, my research I realized that Life of Barrister Savarkar was actually published in Madras in 1923 by G. Paul publication. And in the advertisement says very clearly, it was written by a very famous by a friend of and considering that at the time BBS Iyer was being Pondicherry, which was the French territory and operated to operate Ras and Madras. He could have been who or the other is that Rajgopal who might have written that simply because Savarkar was released jail and took over the presidential in a public speech. Rajaji himself said him, and I quote him about a decade ahead I have written of this biography of this great man. What more can be added than now? Rajaji, who was one of most trusted right hand man, having such a laudatory words to say, also writing his biography. And where have we come? Where they canonize the man. So I think BBS is very important reading that. Thank you for bringing that up.
I have a question. Comment and suggestion. Congratulations. Navalaji was given both of you. Excellent overview. My only request to you, I hate from the IT. And for me, always ML and hearing the history was really spectacular. But what today, the national education. So today is one education thing. Everybody talks about STEM is one very science, technology, engineering, arts and something very our children does not have time for read to laws history. So probably of patriotic leaders of historians where you can 100 video, 1 or 2 snapshots. So that's snapshots. That is the outcome of India. That is the only outcome-based education when it comes to subject. That's the request from my side. And probably another expectation program should be friend of lot of students and college students. Honestly, being here, I engage a lot of momentum. I'm sure the students will also I wish the next program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Sure, Jani.
have a lot of time for you waiting. So அது ஒரு பணிவான ஒரு விஷயம் கொள்ளுங்க ஒரு விஷயம் இந்த ஈவென்ட் சொல்றது ஒரு முக்கியமான ஒரு நடப்பு coming together for purpose. நீங்க சொன்ன மாதிரி திருவாவு மாப்பு அவர்கள் இல்ல திருப்பூர் குமரன் அவர்கள் இந்த மாதிரி வீரன் சின்னவலை பற்றி நான் படிக்கவே பெரிய ஒரு இம்பார்ட்டன்டான ஒரு பர்சனாலிட்டிங்கிற மாதிரி ஒரு இம்பார்ட்டன்ட்டாக நாங்கள் படிக்கிறோம். நீங்க வந்து கண்டிப்பா
ரொம்ப நன்றி. ஒரே நிமிஷம் பதில் சொல்வதற்கான பதில் very common small man like you. But I think history will be kind of என்ன நடந்துச்சுன்னா something happening. நான் ஒரு ஸ்கூல்ல படிக்கும் நான் படிச்ச ஹிஸ்டாரி பொலிட்டிக்கல் பார்ட்டி வந்ததுக்கு அப்புறம் one thing I really ஜாதி தலைவர்களாக கூட்டங்களாக கூட்டி வச்சிருக்கோம். தலையை உடைச்சிருவாங்க பெரிய தலைவர் இந்த கடைசி ஒரு நிறைய தலைவர்கள் வந்து நான் புது கண்ணோட நாட் பொலிட்டிசைசிங் பெர்சே அதை பார்க்கும் பொழுது உதாரணத்திற்கு நான் சொல்ற பேர் நீங்க எந்த லைன்ல போயிட்டு இருக்கீங்க அப்படிங்கிறது. இப்ப விக்ரம்ஜி வந்து ஒரு ரிசர்ச் பண்ணுறது சரியா நம்முடைய தமிழ்நாடு கமிஷன் 6 இடத்துக்கு சென்றிருக்கிறது. கோயம்புத்தூர் சைட்ல இருந்து எல்லா பகுதிகளுக்குமே வந்திருக்காங்க. அதுல வந்து பாத்தீங்கன்னா தீரன் சின்னமலை அப்படின்னு ஒரு கேரக்டர், ஒரு வெரி கிரேட் நேஷனலிஸ்ட் ஒரு ஜாதிக்குள்ள போட்டு அடைச்சு வச்சு. பட் அவரு கூட வேலை செஞ்ச ஆட்கள் எல்லாமே பாத்தீங்கன்னா அவர் கூட இருந்த ஒரு மனிதன். He comes from அருந்ததி அந்த பூரஸ்வதி புகழ் நாம் சொல்றோம். அதே போல குணால நாடாரே போச்சு. அதெல்லாம் கொஞ்சம் எடுத்து fascinating. அதே போல டவுன் சவுத் சிதம்பரம் பிள்ளை அவர் நான் எந்த புத்தகத்தில் ஆனா கோயம்புத்தூர் ஜெயிலுக்கு போனேன். சிதம்பரம் பிள்ளை அவர் எடுத்த சவர்கள் சொல்லியிருப்பார். சாதாரண மனிதர்கள் என்னால விக்ரம்ஜி மேடம் 3 பேர் சேர்ந்து அது மேபி அப்சரா ரெட்டி 4 பேர் இழுக்கவே முடியும். அது ஒரு மனிதர் பிள்ளை கோயம்புத்தூர் அதை வந்து சவர்கர் செல்லுநாடு நீங்க கஷ்டப்பட்டு மாடி இருக்கிறது ஒரு மனுஷன் இழுத்து முடிச்சதுக்கு அப்புறம் ஒரே ஒரு சொல் அதுல இருந்து அந்த இது அதாவது சவர்கர் எண்ணெய் வெளியே வர்றது நம்முடைய இந்தியாவுடைய எண்ணெய் பயன்படுத்தி எல்லாமே நம்ம சொன்னதை விட நான் யாரையும் தவறா சொன்னது பட் நம்ம சில்ட்ரனுக்கு தவறான ஹீரோஸ் இவெல்லாம் வந்து மிகப்பெரிய கண்டிப்பா அடைக்க அவ்வளவு இந்தியன் ஹிஸ்டரி உடைக்கிறாங்க புதிய ஒரு மனிதர்களை வெளியே கொண்டு வர. ஆனால் இப்ப நமக்கு அட்டென்ஷனே இல்லாத ஒரு 10 நிமிஷம் வாட்ஸ்அப்ல எப்படி அவங்கள படிக்கிற நண்பர் கேட்டது கூட வீடியோ அதே கொஸ்டின் வந்து நானும் கேட்டேன். ஆனா சவர்கர் அவர்கள் படிக்க அதே போல நிறைய தலைவர்கள் படிக்கப்பட்டு அதனால அவங்களை படிக்க யூனிவர்சிட்டியை அதோடைய ஆரம்ப வரிகள் அதாவது படிப்பதிலிருந்து விக்ரம் சம்பத்ஜி 30,000-40,000 சீக் பண்ணி கண்டிப்பா அது நடக்கும் மேடம். ஆரணம் சிஸ்டம் தமிழ்நாட்டில் பார்த்தீங்கன்னா ஈஸியா கூட கஷ்டப்படும் நாடி வெளியே நிக்க வச்சிருக்காங்க வெளியே முட்டி போட வச்சிருக்காங்க. அதை இப்ப வந்து நீங்க சொன்னீங்கன்னா உடனே நீ ஜெயிலுக்கு அதாவது அவ்வளவு நடந்து லேர்னிங் கண்டிப்பா அது மாறணும். கண்டிப்பா கொடுப்பீங்க. கண்டிப்பா நிச்சயமா நடக்கும். நிகழ்ச்சியை ஒரு புது எல்லாருமே நம்ம என்ஜாய் பண்ணிக்கிறாங்க. கண்டிப்பா நடக்கும். கண்டிப்பா பஞ்சபூத நாளை முடிவு காரியமாக
Thank you very much for your very insightful for today's event. Vikramji, thank you for bringing this wonderful books to us. Both the books and Random Publishing House helping us to see the books. Buy them. They are for sale outside. And I'm hoping that more people pick them up to read. Akila, of course, in her inimitable style, old friends, absolutely wonderful and has the empathy to bring the right questions to the people on the stage. And I'd like to thank all three of you for being here with us. And I think we have a few people to thank, and nothing is ever possible without the help of people who have been kind to us. And Anandita ji of PK Foundation, she is here. Kindness and patience with us has really been helpful in helping us put this event together. I think I have to say a very big ITC Hotel and Aditya Gupta entirely instrumental in helping us event together today. Anandita ji and also Mr. Gupta also work together to put this for us. And I'd like to thank the audience for being here. And like I said, this needs to go out to a far bigger audience than here. I wish that we could take the same discussion to students across the state of Madras, because there's so much we have to learn. It's astounding what just from this conversation about this amazing man. Thank you so much. I'd like to request to just sit for a couple of minutes. I would like to come forward for a sound bite. Whatever you want. You'll take. I think this gentleman is going to take. Thank you.